suffering may be helpful in seeking a cure. But if you're looking for a reason for your suffering, it requires a much deeper search than merely finding causes, because reasons have meaning attached to them. One's basic theology, one's sense of life's purpose, all get into the conversation when you talk about the reasons for why something is happening. Now, of course, whatever we come up, it's all speculation. Of course, it tells you more about our own thinking than it does about the reality. But personally, I think it's better, take the route of faith. Trust God, even what you don't understand. The mystery of God is to be trusted. And then also take whatever action you believe will make a difference. So that's what the woman did. She reached out to Jesus. That's what Jairus is doing also, reaching out to Jesus for help. But when we look at his story, we need to go a little deeper. Because as sad as the eventual death of our friend Heinz Blumhardt was, at least he was an adult who had raised 4 children to adulthood. Heinz had lived more than 60 years of life. He had been somebody who left a mark. The death of children, on the other hand, strikes a much deeper wound than the death of an adult does. And that's because the primary task of a child is to grow up, to make a future. Dying children cannot fulfill that fundamental task. So the man in today's text, Jairus, he may have been one of the rulers of the synagogue, but this crisis situation, he brought him to his knees. He fell at Jesus' feet, imploring him to come and lay healing hands on his dying daughter. Parents, for the most part, see their role as being life givers, guardians, protectors of their children. The death of a child makes all that impossible. When adults die, whether it's in a sudden tragic event such as those 3,000 Americans on September 11th of 2001, or the Washington, D.C. sniper, the attacks in October a year later, or the suddenness of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, or any of the mass shootings, or the tornadoes, or the storm floods that have been in the news, whether they die suddenly and tragically, or they die in a longer, lingering manner, such as in a nursing home or from cancer, which forces loved ones to rehearse that separation in anticipation of when they finally sever it. Whenever it happens, we can console ourselves in the fact that these adults who are dying had grown up. They'd made a future for themselves. They'd shared our lives, and they had created lasting memories. In contrast, the death of children robs us of all such hoped-for goodness. The kids who were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School or in the Parkland, Florida High School grieve our hearts all that much more. So when Jesus and Jairus and Peter, James, and John came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, they saw a tumult. People were weeping and wailing loudly. Now, isn't that what we would expect at the death of a child? When Jesus said, "This child is not dead, but only sleeping," they laughed at him. For that reason, he allowed no one but the parents and his 3 disciples to enter the room. Because all that unbelief, all that weeping and wailing, all the laughing mockery stays out. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her 1969 classic text on death and dying, popularized the concept that there are stages of grief, which includes initial denial. This is not happening, can't be. And then there's some bargaining, presumably bargaining with God for a better outcome, as well as anger. Well, maybe the mourners in Jairus' house thought that Jesus was in denial. Or maybe their laughter indicated that they thought this bargaining period with God was over. The messenger said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." That need to understand what has happened becomes a priority for many people when they're involved in suffering. So quite often investigations are ordered. Right? The need to blame somebody, or said a little more nicely, hold someone accountable. is also a frequent response to tragedies. We want to know who caused this epidemic. Who was caught unprepared and why? Why is everything shut down? See, when we cannot blame the victims of the event, because we know that would just add to our suffering of their loss. And when there's no obvious perpetrators, no obvious villain who brought this tragedy about, well, then some people simply turn on God, that God must be the one who is to blame. Couldn't God have fixed this better? Where are you, God? Biblical wisdom tradition has an answer for that. Biblical wisdom tradition, as represented in the book of Job, in Proverbs, in Ecclesiastes, and numerous Psalms, insists that our universe is both rational and consistent, because it's guided by an all-seeing wisdom, Sophia in Greek, or Logos, the Word, the divine intelligence that's bringing it all together. So the answer is, good things happen to people because they've lived in such a way as to deserve it. Blessings follow the way of the wise. I'm sure you've encountered people who think that way. Then bad things happen either because we have been a fool or we've done something wicked, sin. The consequence of ignorance brings ruin. The penalty for evil, they say, is the wrath of God. Now, this kind of theology seems to be pervasive in American Christianity. In either case, though, the suffering, whether the blessing you're receiving or the suffering, is considered appropriate. And the suffering is particularly to teach someone a lesson. So we insist on imposing penalties, or people have to pay the price. The lesson that they were to learn out of the suffering was the reason for the trouble. That's wisdom tradition, biblical. Regardless of what caused it, the reason was they had a lesson to learn. Either you're going to come out of it wiser, or more empathetic, or changed in some way for the good, or if we fail to learn our lesson, then we're punished for our failure. Now, I dissected that way of thinking at length in chapter 5 of my doctoral paper. I was hoping to lay it to rest, but it continues to find its adherents. Just last week, in the Alpena News, in a letter to the editor, Laurel Lisi of Rogers City wrote, and I quote, "A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences." Proverbs 22, verse 3. Prudence, please. That was her prayer. That was her petition in the letter to the editor. Take precautions. Don't be a simpleton. Theologian John Cobb writes, and I quote him, "At first blush, speaking of diseased patients suffering in relation to such a moral law seems extremely cruel. But the situation is more complex. Many people can deal better with suffering when they see it as just, rather than seemingly wholly irrational." I will not discredit those faithful souls who seek to find the reason for their pain. Those folks who say, there's a message for me in it, I know there is, I just don't know what it is. And I'm happy to take the time to reflect back to those folks in a counseling setting, their earnest speculations of hope that a meaningful realization can come out of it. But in the end, I actually prefer Rabbi Harold Kushner's frank observation from his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He says, sometimes there is no reason apart from the workings of impersonal laws of nature. And I also appreciate the rabbi's public admission that life is not fair. I like to think that those hard times that we go through, those struggles that life throws at us, presents us with challenges that may lead to further growth. Yes, even the coronavirus threat, even this economic shutdown may lead us to further growth and knowledge and empathy, sensitivity that we're all in this thing together. But if that's true, then let's approach this thing with faith remembering what Jesus said to the father who was suffering with the dying of his daughter, "Do not fear, only believe." And as he said to the woman who was healed from a chronic hemorrhage, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Well, that is my prayer for you today as we enter May, still in sequestered settings. My prayer for you and for all who suffer in this time of coronavirus, the imposed, the isolation. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. In Jesus' name, amen.